All right.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Shani, and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight's event with Kelefa Sanneh, presenting their new book, Major Labels, A History of Music in 7 Genres. He'll be talking with Zoe Chace, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I want to say a huge thanks to everyone here and at Penguin for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. A couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. There are different ways that you can interact with them and the other attendees though. The first is the chat, and the second is through the Q&A module, which is the 2 speech bubbles at the bottom of your screen. We'll only be answering questions from the Q&A, so make sure to put them there if you have any. Most importantly, tonight's featured book, Major Labels, is available for sale from Greenlight bookstore, in person or online. I'm going to put the link into the chat a couple times throughout the night, so make sure to click on it and take a look. Our interviewer tonight is Zoe Chace. Zoe is a producer and reporter at This American Life. She's most recently the co-creator of the Improvement Association, a podcast from Serial and the New York Times that tells a true story about election fraud. Zoe was speaking with our featured author, Kelefa Sanneh. Kelefa has been a New York staff writer since 2008, before he spent 6 years as a pop music critic at the New York Times. He's also a contributor to CBS Sunday Morning. His writing has also appeared in a number of magazines and a handful of books, including Shake It Up, Great American Writing, on Rock and Pop from Elvis to Jay-Z, a library of American special publication, and Dacopa Best Music Writing. He lives in New York City with his family. His new book, Major Labels, is a deep study of how popular music unites and divides us, charting the way genres become communities, shape-shifting across the years, giving us a way to track larger forces and controversies. Sanneh distills a career's worth of knowledge about music and musicians into a brilliant and omnivorous reckoning with popular music as an art form, actually a bunch of art forms, as a cultural and economic force, and as a tool that we use to build our identities. We'll be starting tonight with a little spiel from Kelefa.
Hi, thanks Shani and to Greenlight for having me and Zoe here. We wish we could be there in person. Thanks to Zoe for agreeing to come and talk to me.
You're so welcome.
So we're here today mainly because when I was 14, my best friend Matt gave me a punk rock mixtape. I actually have the mixtape here. This is the punk rock mixtape I got when I was 14, and it converted me. I mean, people talk about the zeal of a convert, and that was me. I was like, that's it. I'm only listening to punk rock from now on. I'm not listening to anything else. The Rolling Stones are dead to me. It's a wrap. And this kind of took over my life. It was the first time I really cared about music, and I went deep into it. I spent my high school years trying to find the weirdest, craziest, coolest, most underground records I could find. I was somewhat insufferable, as you can tell, perhaps more insufferable than I am now. By the time I got to college, I sort of got a second instruction in punk rock. I went to Harvard, and the Harvard radio station WHRB had this tyrannical rock and roll department that was devoted to punk, and they insisted on taking us all aside, giving us an exam, giving us an informal semester-long course in the history of punk, basically teaching us the punk rock orthodoxy. And that was interesting to me because I didn't know there was such a thing as a punk rock orthodoxy. It sounded sort of like a contradiction in terms. What I learned there was that every genre has its orthodoxy, even or especially the ones that claim to be super rebellious. And that was interesting to me as I kept listening to punk rock and then got interested in other music. You know, after a while of listening to punk and the idea is you're kind of breaking the rules or it's defiant in some way, you know, I get to thinking well, what would be a way to break those punk rock rules? What's more punk than punk? And that sort of led me on an endless journey toward hip hop, toward dance music, R&B, pop music, eventually country music. My tastes kind of got more, as Shani said in her introduction, omnivorous. Eventually in 2002, I landed as the pop music critic at the New York Times, where I got to listen to everything all day long. It was super fun, as you can imagine, exhausting in a good way. And then I went on to the New Yorker in 2008, where I'm a staff writer writing about whatever I get obsessed with. And one of the things that has obsessed me ever since I was 14 is music. So I wrote this book, Major Labels, which is a history of popular music in 7 genres. And it tells the story of everything that happened in popular music, not everything, but a lot of things that have happened in popular music in the half century, basically since the Beatles broke up. There's this idea out there that we know what happened in the 60s, that it was like something about the Vietnam War and rock and roll. Like those are kind of familiar stories, even if they're not exactly accurate. But a lot of people feel like in the 70s, things started to get weird and get obscure, and music became this thing that was just like complicated, and someone's over there listening to death metal and there's someone else listening to country, but country seems to mean a lot of different things at once, and it's just a mess. So I wrote this book as a way to hopefully help people think about this mess and engage with this mess and make this mess seem a little less messy. It's 7 chapters, each one devoted to a different story of a different genre: rock and roll, R&B, country music, punk rock, hip hop, dance music, and pop. And basically how people thought about those kinds of music and argued over them. And in order to demonstrate that, Zoe and I will be arguing for you here tonight.
No. Okay, so let me.
Hi, Zoe.
Hello, hi. I do want to start off by saying like that you are my friend and that your book is great. And I'm
This is
really
a full
excited
disclosure
about
and
it.
a compliment all wrapped into one. That's really nice.
Yeah. Well, like it's not going to get too personal, but I did do this thing where I went and found so basically like you just listed a lot of your qualifications for why you thought that you could write a book about like basically all the music. And I have described it to my friends as a very like deeply comprehensive and yet manages to still be very enjoyable history of basically all the music. And I would say my favorite chapters are probably hip hop and country, because those are the genres that I like, and I'm probably going to ask you about them. But you kind of like, you went over a little bit of this already, but I would say your qualifications to write a book as sort of nerdy and deep and yet enjoyable as this one do kind of start with what happened to you in high school with your like musical awakening.
Yeah.
So first I'm just going to play like, this is, I think, your favorite song from high school. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to share this. Okay. Kay's favorite song.
Wow, look at this. This is some multimedia stuff happening.
Just don't turn it up at this moment. Like you might want to turn it down. Okay. So that's the music that you're into? Okay.
That's the Boredoms from their classic 1989 album, Soul Discharge.
Thank you so much, radio DJ. Okay, can you just like slow down a little bit? Like tell me the story of like the musical origin story that you had. You had the mixtape, I saw that, but you kind of went as far as one could go down that rabbit hole, which is kind of your thing.
Well, yeah, because like the exciting thing to me about that mixtape, it wasn't even just the music. Like, yeah, the Dead Kennedys sounded good, Sex Pistols sounded good to me, but it was the idea of rejection, the idea that like everyone listens to music and there's music on MTV and your friends like music and it's fine, but it's actually possible to reject all that. It's actually possible to say, no, I'm not listening to any of that. I'm going to choose something else. And that fact of choosing, and the fact that you could choose something strange, you could choose something that reflects something about who you are. You could choose something that reflects your identity and shows that you're different from everyone else. That was really appealing to me and really exciting to me.
But so like, that's what you chose. Like you chose that noise, right?
Well, yeah, it was really like, people often describe, if you play someone, I don't know, Minor Threat, right? Classic hardcore punk band, they might say that sounds kind of noisy. Noisy is a word that people often use to describe punk rock.
Okay.
And so I love taking things past their logical conclusion. So when I started listening to noisy music, quite soon after, I thought, well, like, what's noisier than that? What's the noisiest music that it's possible to listen to? And I found my way to bands like the Boredoms, this Japanese band that was probably drawing pretty heavily from the Butthole Surfers, who were a classic noisy American band of the 1980s. I found my way to a whole scene of so-called noise music. This was musicians mainly in Japan who were making music that kind of resembled pure static.
Yeah.
There's a whole theory of noise, right?
Like more than what we already heard. It was like more noisy than what we just heard.
Yeah, we were hearing instruments and someone screaming. Like, pure static, in a sense, is the noisiest thing you could imagine. But actually, when you're listening to pure white noise, it's not that noisy because nothing's really happening. And so it's sort of soothing. So often if you're looking for noisy music, you need stuff to be happening. You need little explosions and eruptions to keep it sort of unpleasant. In that way, we expect noise to be unpleasant, because otherwise, if it's just static, the noise starts sounding a lot like silence. I mean, noise is a really tricky concept in the world of music, but this was one way to take to and possibly past its logical conclusion. If normal music is over here and punk rock is a little noisier than that, I was like, let's go far out to the outer edge, to the most punk thing we can find. The problem,
like, why do you do that? Why do you do that in general? Like, when you're interested in something, you take it, like you are like the rabbit hole tour guide of all rabbit hole tour guides, and you're like so cheerful about it. Like, why did you like listen to the Sex Pistols and then you're like, okay, Japanese noise music is now where I go?
Well, I wanted to figure out how it worked. I mean, I think I loved the idea. I think I understood, I don't know if I would have put it this way, that punk rock is a relative term. Punk rock, when you think about it, something can only be punk rock in relation to something else. Something is punk because it's more something than the mainstream music. It's noisier, it's faster, it's meaner, it's dumber, it's wilder, right? That's what punk means. And so if punk rock is a relative term, then to me, it seemed obvious in my 14 or maybe 15-year-old brain, like, okay, this punk stuff is good. Like, let's turn it up a little bit. Let's find the punkest thing we can, partially as a way of like enjoying more of this thing that I love, this feeling of punk. But also, I think I realize now, as a way of figuring it out. Like, what does this mean? If this country record sounds good, let me find like the countryest thing. And what does it even mean to be country? And what does it mean not to be country? And, I think a lot of these debates can seem really, they can seem pretty abstract and esoteric. But I think also they do shape the way all of us, even people who are maybe a little more normal than me, listen to music, because all part of the thrill of listening to music is social, is that you're thinking about this world and you're thinking about who else listens to this stuff and who's making this stuff and what's going on in their world. And part of what that means for there to be a world or for there to be a community is some people are included and some other people are excluded. And so to me, going to extremes was a way of thinking through what's included in this world that I'm exploring and what's excluded.
Okay. Yeah, you've always been kind of like interested in the anatomy of basically the music or whatever it is, the thing is that you're examining. But that's just funny to me that that's how you were growing up also. Like you were, I guess my point is like you were a very thorough person this whole time. Like
it was harder to be thorough back then.
Yeah,
albums were expensive. You're saving up your allowance or whatever to try and buy a cassette. In my day, it was cassettes, and sometimes they were bad. Yes, it's been an adjustment to me to get used to the kind of like fire hose of music that we all have coming at us. But yes, then you're right. It certainly was like it was literally, how can I consume as much music as possible? And in those days, you reached the financial limit way before you reached the limit of the number of hours in a day.
That was your one constraint. I was kind of wondering what your like very worldly parents thought of like the Butthole Surfers poster that was in your room.
Yeah,
like
it was a very harsh looking poster. In retrospect, I'm surprised they let me put it up, but they kind of, I don't know. I think they understood that, I had found something strange that I was into. And, on some level, having known me for the 14 years before that, they can't have been totally surprised by that. And, I write about this in the book. My version of punk rock, there's lots of different versions of punk rock. My version of punk rock was like pretty abstract and pretty clean cut. Me and my friends didn't know a lot of punks. We weren't doing a lot of punk stuff. We
Right, it was
were
like
really
about the music, right?
Yeah, we were kind of just like nerding out on the music. It wasn't like we were like staying out late and getting into trouble. We were just like in the basement listening to cassettes. And so I think they also understood maybe, I could ask my mother after this is done, that there was something, she should be on here alongside you. She, I'm sure, has some questions.
I think she does. I
think
that
maybe
vibe.
they understood that there was something studious about what I was doing. I don't know if they would have put it that way, but yes, they were, they were kind enough to not interfere too much.
Yeah, like it was your identity, but it was also kind of an academic question that you were exploring. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, I don't know if that might make it sound more elevated than what we were actually doing in high school, but sure.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But it does get actually very academic for you because you go to like this fancy school in Cambridge. But the thing
called Harvard.
Yeah, that's the school, right? Just thank you for clarifying. And you go to the radio station, and the radio station, like I went to Oberlin, people would go to the radio station, they would play records, and like that was kind of the whole thing that happened there. But what happened at the punk station at Harvard when you were at Harvard is like the geekiest thing that I've heard about Harvard ever. It was the perfect place for you to go.
Yeah, they gave an exam. There was literally a written exam with like a listening identification part and an essay question part. And anyone who wanted to try and be part of this rock department, it was called the Record Hospital, still is actually. Anyone who wanted to be part of this Record Hospital, which was the name of what they were doing, had to pass this exam. And, I should say that like knowledge wasn't the only way to pass this exam. I found out later back, in the years after that, I obviously started administering this exam and so saw it from the other side. And you weren't just looking for knowledge, but you were looking for a certain spirit. How do people respond to music? What are they into? What do they look for? And so, yeah, they played us a bunch of samples of music and we could identify what we could and write down little notes. And then they asked us some more open-ended essay questions. I can't remember what the essay questions were. And I remember like literally within minutes, I was like, oh, I got this. Because it was just exactly the stuff I was into. It was nerdy on exactly the level I was, but it was also in that year and the years to come. And so, and once you get in, once you pass the exam, you then have to take a semester long unofficial course where a different radio DJ gives a lecture every week. Right. And on various, on some form of punk.
Can DJ the radio station at Harvard. Yes. Like this isn't like, you're not like majoring in punk music.
No, this is all just like
this
DIY.
Is extracurricular.
This has nothing to do with the faculty. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a lecture every week.
So much.
And a bucket of records, like 10 records, 5 or 10 records. And then you've got to listen to this lecture and then come in sometime during the week on your own and like listen to these records and write down what you think about them. And
then, sorry, go ahead.
And it was a way of getting to know the new kids who wanted to be DJs. And it was a way of like familiarizing us with the canon of this punk rock thing we were engaging with. And to me, it was also this lesson of like, no, there is a canon. Like the reality of punk rock is different in a way from the rhetoric of it. And the rhetoric of it is like, it's punk rock, we're going to do whatever we want. But then like in reality, the Sex Pistols kind of sound like the Ramones, and the Ramones kind of sound like the Stooges, and the Stooges even kind of sound like the Seeds or the Sonics. And like, it's a very specific tradition. It's not about like total freedom. It's a one specific path. And so in a weird way, learning that path was a way of of exalting punk rock, but it was also a way of putting punk rock in its place in a weird way of saying like, no, punk rock is not all inclusive. No genre is all inclusive. Punk rock is just like one path through this thicket, through this forest of music.
But I guess like what I'm getting at, and probably too subtly, that I like so much is that you liked the orthodoxy of it, like the actual orthodoxy of
punk absolutely rock,
yeah, like you got really into. And what happens in this book basically is that you're constantly like, here's the orthodoxy of this thing. Okay, but now here's what's wrong with that. But here's how we make walls around it. But here's why the walls are so permeable. And it seemed like my sort of theory of what happened to you, like the
Here it
reason that
comes.
you
Here it
compulsively had,
comes.
no, it's not like that, but like the reason why you had to compulsively write this book that's about all the music, which is like a crazy thing that you did. It's an amazing book, but is a really crazy endeavor that you tried to bite off, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's like, it has to do with what happened to you at Harvard and with the Butthole Surfers and with the noisy music, that basically like you kind of absorb the orthodoxy so hard of this one particular genre, and it made you like actually want to somehow like rebel against it, explode it. And then you had to systematically go through all the other genres and like explode those. And now that's like your entire job that you did this. Like you took a year off school just to work at a record store.
Yeah.
Which
makes it sound crazy, but actually in my defense, Zoe, I was working at 2 record stores. So, you know,
oh, okay.
One of them was a warehouse where I was putting price tags on CDs during the week. And then at the weekend, I was behind the counter of an indie shop in Harvard Square. But yes, it was that level of obsession. But I think you've certainly identified something true, which is for me, but I also think for most people, including you, we want these 2 contradictory things from music at the same time. We want it to give us a sense of community and a sense of like being in a place with some people in community, maybe even in communion with those people, right? Whether it's just one night at a concert, or it's because, you know, you're a country fan and you love listening to country radio, whatever it is, that's one of the things that popular music is great at. But we also like music, especially popular music, to represent freedom, right? We chafe at the idea of like, oh, you've got to stay within this community and these are the musical rules.
There's like a rebellion always inherent in being a fan of the music.
Yeah, because we want both. We want that sense of community and that sense of freedom from music. And genres are built out of that dynamic, out of the fact that these successive people want freedom and the musicians want musical freedom. And at the same time, they want to be in community. And I think that push and pull, like, yeah, it defines punk rock, but like it also defines R&B in a different sense. And it defines country and hip hop. And so, yes, I think that's kind of like the lesson that I learned, was that the identity forming part of music, the fact that we use it to sort of figure out who we are, like that's widely true. And that's why it's popular. And that's why we argue about it in a way that we don't always argue about other forms.
Do you think, so just there's this question here, which I think is relevant to this moment. If you didn't do that like extracurricular level of studying, like, do you think about punk music in general, do you think you would be a music critic today? I mean, you're beyond music criticism probably at this point, but like that has been your livelihood, like that's your life. And is it because of that class and that year off, do you think?
It's hard to know what things would have been like. I mean, one thing that's true, ironically, is that if I had stayed obsessed mainly with punk, I might not have bothered to really get interested in writing about music. The thing that made me want to write about music wasn't that there's like a great vegetarian hardcore punk band from Rhode Island called Drop Dead that's playing in a church common room. Like that was awesome, but I wasn't like, oh, I've got to tell the world about this. I was just like, that was a great show.
Like you just did.
Sure. It was falling back in love with hip hop. And that's what I'd listened to as a boy. And during the year I actually was spending working in record stores, I got super obsessed with hip hop again. And that was the thing that made me want to write about music, because that was the thing that made me feel like there was a story to be told, that a lot of these hip hop acts were selling millions of copies of albums. Most people writing about music didn't like this stuff. A lot of the people writing about hip hop at the time didn't really like hip hop. A lot of the people writing about hip hop, they'd be like a hip hop specialist and they'd be like, oh, well, there's this cool thing happening underground, but they didn't care about like Juvenile and Nelly or like even Jay-Z in the early years. And so that there was a journalistic impulse that made me really want to write about music, which is this thing is happening and people are missing it. These people are making amazing music. This is a historic time in America because these records are so great and they're not getting treated with the seriousness of a Bruce Springsteen or whatever, right? Like that was part of it. That was part of it for me. It was like, yo, Jay-Z is just as awesome as Bruce Springsteen. And I can't believe he's not getting that kind of serious attention.
Yeah, well, we are going to get into that. I was wondering, so I guess basically like I want to ask you about rockism, but I was first going to just kind of like, I think, go over the reason that you wrote the book a little bit more, like the ideas actually in the book, because I really just want to talk about you and your life and your biography. But I do think like it's important to take on exactly what you're taking on in the book, which is this thing about genres that I've even been texting you about. First of all, just do the basic, like, why did you write this book at this exact moment? Like, why do we need this book at this exact moment? What are you trying to say now?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
That's the first.
I mean,
Okay.
I could say what I think. I could say what I think you're going to say, but you say what you're going to say.
There's two reasons. Like, there's the personal reason, which is that, I spent these 6 years as a pop music critic at the New York Times. And then all these years later, felt like I had enough distance from it to really zoom out and say like, oh, here's how I feel like all this stuff works. So that's the personal reason why I like this book at this time. But more broadly, there is this idea that genres are disappearing or dissolving, and that maybe they deserve to dissolve, that maybe genres are bad, maybe genres are the enemies of music, maybe genres enforce all sorts of inequalities and exclusions that we should want to be rid of. And maybe in the Spotify era, where we're all just kind of like clicking through playlists, that maybe they're not so important anymore. Maybe this is the era of Doja Cat and Lil Nas X and Post Malone, and like, who even really knows or cares what genre they are? Everyone's collaborating with everyone, and like, it doesn't really matter. And so, being a somewhat mischievous person, one of the things I wanted to do with this book is push back against that a little bit, and to push back by saying, first of all, am I doing A and B or 1 and 2? Maybe I'll do 1. So first of all, like, genres are really important, and it's hard, you can't really understand where we are in music and how it works and how we listen to it without understanding this story of genre. But second, that throughout the history of the last 50 years, there have been these moments, like maybe this moment now, when it feels like genres are fading away, where it feels like everyone's going to be making the same kind of music, like it's not really relevant. I talk about the late 70s in the book, and Rod Stewart is making disco records. Diana Ross is making disco records. The Rolling Stones, Star Wars, the Bee Gees, like everyone's making disco records. And there is a sense of like, oh, well, maybe this is just what it is. Like, maybe we're all going to come together on the dance floor, dancing to records by Dolly Parton and by R&B groups and by rock bands, and it's all one thing, right? And
right, like all music is disco or something like that.
Yeah, and the disco is like the universal solvent, right? And like, it's a really utopian moment in a lot of ways. It's a really inspiring moment. But of course, for a lot of people who were living through it, they were like, this stinks, disco sucks. And there's this huge backlash to it, right? Because of this dynamic that I talked about, because we love pushing away as much as we love being pulled in. And so that's kind of a great example of how these moments of coming together, where everyone seems to be listening to the same thing, and these genre boundaries are dissolving, they tend to give way to moments of the opposite, moments where things are very divisive, where things are very argumentative, where things are more tribal, where people are setting themselves apart from other people. So, one possibility is that the modern moment is just a precursor to the next backlash and the next moment of musical tribalism and musical division. And I think it's not one or the other. Like, you need both, right? You need that spirit of coming together and that spirit of pushing apart.
I guess do you think, you talk about the fear that genres are disappearing, but do you think that they are? Like, there's this one moment in the book, and I don't know if it's tacky to quote you at you, but I mean,
I'll allow
why
it.
not? Because like, it's your interview. But basically, you were talking about the term hipster and why people react so negatively to the term hipster,
Right.
and speaking sort of maybe as a self-appointed hipster in that moment in the book. But you say that part of the reason why people react so negatively to the term is that it reflects a widespread fear that the old musical communities, the old tribes, no longer function as they used to, having been replaced by a hazy mega tribe of connoisseurs who don't truly care about anything in particular. So that's like a fear that people have, I guess, that like people are no longer passionate about music, but is that
That's the
true?
that's the downside of hipsterdom, right?
Yeah.
And the upside of hipsterdom is like, oh, you're like more open-minded than the old punks, right? The upside of hipsterdom is like, you can appreciate country music and you can appreciate some R&B, and you've got like a techno record back home, and like you're listening to all sorts of stuff. So,
Mhm.
you know, hipsterdom, part of the reason why people react negatively to it is that it's like the upside and the downside of a certain kind of open-mindedness. Like that's not, my fear is actually a little bit different. I think as
Uh-huh.
long as music is as important in our lives and helps us define ourselves, we're always going to care about it and form tribes about it and form communities about it. That's what we do, right? And so I don't think that could change, but I think it's possible that music won't always play that role. And in other words, music plays that role now in a way that, you know, theater doesn't. And you don't, you
Mhm.
know, you can't
Sure.
imagine going to a high school and like asking everyone their favorite playwright, or seeing like, oh, there's the kids who like that play over there and the kids who like that kind of, like, that's not really how we define ourselves. And certainly as
Mhm.
young people traditionally, music has played that role. Music doesn't, there's reasons why music is good at that role, because it's very social, because we often listen to it in groups while talking. So it forms these social connections such that when we listen to music, even when we're not in a group, we find ourselves thinking about our friends or the other people who might be into what we're into.
Mhm.
And so it is very social, it works really well, but it won't necessarily always serve that role. And so if I have a fear, it's a
Yeah.
fear that like, oh, maybe we're moving toward a world where music just isn't that important and people don't care as much about music anymore, right? Maybe a new generation uses politics to define themselves in the way that an older generation used music. Maybe you get maybe you get some cred in that world by being into a cause that's maybe a little bit unusual or a little bit out there, in a way that you used to get some cred in certain worlds by being into a singer or a rapper or a band that no one had heard of. And so if there's a fear, it's a fear that like, oh, maybe music itself, maybe the obsession that we have as a culture with popular music,
Mhm.
maybe that could fade a little bit as people get into gaming or politics or something else. I don't know if that's happening, but to me, that's the fear. As long as we're listening to a lot of music and we're obsessed with music, we'll always be making and unmaking these communities.
And like, why would that be happening? I guess was the thing that I was trying to figure out. There's the question of like, is it bad that Drake is, you know, one of the most streamed artists of all time? He's a singer and a rapper, and like maybe he's in a couple different genres. Is that bad or good? That's kind of a question for the music critics. But why do you think like we're at this moment now where things are starting to kind of blend together, or maybe we're losing track of genres, or really that we're not defining ourselves in the communities around music that we used to? Why would that be
Yeah.
happening now?
Well, I will say that there's evidence that points in both directions, right? Like you look
Uh-huh.
at, you know, when you look at the current controversy over Casey Musgraves being nominated for a Grammy in the pop category instead of the country category. And
Uh-huh.
she and her team are like, hell no, I'm a country singer. This is offensive. I deserve to be part of the country category. Don't put me in the pop category, right? That's a good
Okay.
example of the way that genre is still really important to performers, and I think still important to listeners. So I definitely don't think it has already gone away. You know, there's a broader question of, you know, the broader question of what's going on and why now. I think it has something to do, you know, I talk in the book a lot about like radio and
Yeah.
radio plays and which songs got played on the radio and which songs sold well, which records sold really well, you know, partly because I like data. We often don't have great data when it comes to popular music, but it's a useful reality check often. When people are saying like, oh, and this band was everywhere, it sometimes is a useful reality check to go back and look at some of the numbers and say, well, were they everywhere?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the musical communities of the old days were built around radio and built around records and concert tickets, which is another way of saying they were built around scarcity. They were built around the fact that like you couldn't access everything. There were narrow channels where you could get what you could get. And the community of like a bunch of people hanging out at a record store, or even the kid with her ear to the radio and a tape deck getting ready to tape her favorite song off the radio. Like a lot of these rituals were rituals of scarcity.
Right.
And living as we do now in an era of musical abundance, not scarcity, one of the questions is like, what are the new rituals that are going to emerge? And how are we going to build community around those new rituals? What are they even going to look like? And sometimes it's just like
That
the
is an
old
exciting
rituals.
question.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
go ahead.
sometimes it's the old rituals continuing in a kind of a postmodern form, right? Like people going on iTunes and buying downloads of a single by a pop singer they like in order to get her to the top of the charts, even though they're not going to do anything with this MP3 that they've bought because they already have access to all the music, right? So the buying is a purely performative gesture, right? It's just a way of showing you're a fan and spending a little money that doesn't really get you anything. And that's a good example of some of this, of how some of these old scarcity gestures live on in this new era. And I think if there is a change, I mean, there's probably a lot, but that is one of the changes now, right? That the question of how do you, insofar as radio stations and record stores encourage these communities, what happens when we shift to streaming music sites? How do Apple Music and Spotify encourage or recognize these communities? And we're still trying to figure that out, right? Like they do it with playlists, and on Spotify you can click on genres and moods, and you can get inside a genre, or you can get inside a mood which might include a few different genres.
Yeah, it'll be like Spooky Sunday or whatever, you know, and it's just like a crazy mix. It's like Nina Simone and Post Malone or whatever.
Yes. But online, you also get these micro communities of so-called stans, right? Which are devoted to just one musical act, right? And you can go online and you can yell at people about BTS all day long, and you can be in that world.
K-pop band.
The K-pop band. And so that's an example of a modern musical community. I guess it's a successor to the old fan clubs back in the day. But this is an example of how you can get totally inside the world of just one artist now. And that's in a more interactive way than was possible before. So again, those are both examples of fandom becoming, you know, in some ways, a little more casual, and in some ways a lot less casual. As often in pop music, it feels like both things are happening at once.
Okay. So we're not necessarily losing the like devoted, passionate music fan. Like that, if we were losing that person, that would be incredibly sad to me. You know,
might
like
be a relief to some people.
That's true. I'm not around maybe enough like passionate music fans these days.
That would cure you of it.
But you know, like that's that if in fact the tribalism that everyone's worried about kind of in our politics or whatever that people are writing about, if that's replacing music tribalism, I don't know. I guess I do think that there is like something to be mourned there. The passion around music is like a very special part of, I think, just how a lot of us have grown up.
Yeah, I mean, always, right? Like I love music. So of course I would be sad if it occupied a less prominent place. Although with any cultural change, there's always reason to celebrate and reason to mourn, right? You see that with like, you mentioned hip hop and country music, two of the genres that maybe evolve the most rapidly and in most controversial ways, such that in each of those genres, it's common to talk to people that are saying like, oh, this stuff they're doing now, it's not like what they were doing back when I was in high school. And I'm like, no, it's really not. Like,
like you say, people are always worried about hip hop. I like that. I think that's really cool.
Like they always think that it's a problem. So similarly, yes, if people are taking some of that energy that they used to pour into like finding obscure records, and like now that energy is going into like political activism, like that's not necessarily a change for the worse for America, but you know, there's likely to be upsides and downsides.
Well, you are deeply like unsentimental about like nostalgia. You're not, just because people maybe have a nostalgic feeling, that's no reason to trust it that something was better before.
Well, but I myself am, I myself have something of an allergy to like nostalgia in culture. It always makes me suspicious when I see like, you know, a band and they've recreated the costumes of like some earlier era to make that like old fashioned music. Like that always puts me on edge, even though sometimes the jams turn out to be great. But I do sometimes worry that reflects my own worry that the current moment is intensely and overwhelmingly nostalgic. And in that sense, that might be its own form of nostalgia, right?
Wait, so you are worried always that people are nostalgic for before? Like that's the anxiety you have?
Well, there's a part of me that's nostalgic for a time when people were a little less nostalgic.
Right. Okay, that's your issue. That's your issue. But speaking of that, of sort of making a career out of nostalgia, something that you did that I think a lot of people know about, but just in case they don't, is this essay you wrote, The Rap Against Rockism.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about it before we like get to questions from other people. And I'm not the one asking all the questions, because first I want you to set it up for me, like describe what that was, that moment. Ashley Simpson is caught lip syncing. That's how your essay opens. So describe what you were writing about.
So it's 2004, and I started feeling like the world of music, that people were separating it into high and low, and that there were these acclaimed bands that got serious consideration, and then there were these like pop or R&B songs that got relegated to like VH1 shows about awesomely craptacular singles or whatever. And I was a little frustrated because I felt like there was some music that wasn't getting the recognition that it deserved, but I also felt like people hadn't thought through their ideas about what made music good and what we should even be looking for in music. And so I used this term rockism in this essay, which, dates back to the early 80s in the UK, where there was this ongoing debate basically about whether rock was awesome. The idea was that generations of listeners had taken it for granted that rock was cool and that rock was the coolest. And therefore, we're evaluating other kinds of musicians by asking whether they lived up to rock and roll values. And there was a new crop of musicians and writers in the early 80s in the UK who said, no, wait a second, like maybe rock is not cool. Maybe rock is boring. Like maybe all these like sweaty dudes with their guitars and their jeans, like maybe that's actually the worst. And it would be more fun to celebrate pop as something that's new, as something that's colorful, a spirit of not being ashamed of selling out, but embracing success, right? Like let's be danceable. Let's be forthright about wanting to make a lot of money. Let's sing silly love songs. Let's have colored hair, right? And this is over here, some of that music is grouped as new wave. Sometimes people would say new romantic or new pop, but it's,
you write about that era in this book, right? Like this is Boy George and stuff.
It's Boy George, but it's also, it's Flock of Seagulls, it's Human League, it's Haircut 100, it's ABC. It's a whole bunch of bands, a lot of which didn't, ironically, get all that popular. But the way of thinking about music, that ended up really reverberating through the years as people, not just critics, but often music critics, tried to think through like, well, what is it that we value in music? Like, does it make sense to like talk more about albums as the measure of greatness as opposed to singles? Like, are we celebrating live concerts as somehow being more real than a great music video? And what I wrote about in this rockism essay was that if that's how you think about music, if you're listening to hip hop and being like, well, which of these guys has like the rock and roll spirit, then you're going to be missing out on a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of music that's great or potentially great that you just can't hear because it doesn't sound like Bruce Springsteen, or it doesn't follow that script. And so, I said, I think at the end of the essay, I said basically, that there's a lot of new music and that rockism was like this old prejudice, and that there's a lot of new music happening and that we need some new prejudices instead. And the reason I said that is because without a prejudice, without some sort of preconception, it's hard to evaluate anything. It's without some idea about what you want from music, some desire of what you want from music, it's hard to say anything about what's good or what's bad. And the interesting thing about music is that each community, each genre tends to produce its own ideas about what's valuable. And so rockism, it's not that rockism should be destroyed, but it's that rockism is just one way of listening to music. And so part of what I wanted to do in this book was look at all the other isms, right? R&B-ism, country-ism, hip-hop-ism. Like every community has its own isms that focuses and elevates some things while diminishing and ignoring some other things. And
I want to ask about that, but I can't yet. I still want to just like nail down this like rockism thing, because wait, like that was 15 years ago that you were basically making the point that, inside music criticism, basically the conventional wisdom was to be like, if you're not sort of an authentic like basically a rock star that plays guitar,
Right.
then that's all the music outside of that is not really considered good. You called it a
Right.
guilty pleasure, which I liked
Yeah.
a lot. Like, I remember that. And then you're like, no, here's what's wrong with that. Here's like all the problems with that. I remember when I was at NPR, which wasn't actually 15 years ago, but like getting there, it was the same kind of vibe. It was like, it wouldn't be weird now to hear a story on NPR about Rihanna, but it was then. It was like, oh,
Right.
it's gotten crazy, or oh, we're doing this, extra thing that's like not really about the music, but now it's like,
I wrote at the time that Destiny's Child was thought of as just like kind of like a silly girl group. And like, insofar as there was like a lack of respect for Beyonce, like, I think that's been remedied in the years since I wrote that. Not, of course, because of me, but just like things have changed.
Well, certainly not in the case of Beyonce.
Probably because of Beyonce, I would suspect.
But then it's like, I just want to make sure to nail down, that was 15 years ago that you were making that point that people sort of weren't taking pop music of the time seriously, or at least just being like, there's great music and then there's guilty music, and that's just a totally artificial designation. But now you also write about, and other people have written about, that then the sort of world of music criticism all rushed over to the side that you were kind of elevating, and maybe like weighing it down too heavily. Well, maybe it was, I don't know, it was a big deal, this essay. And now people are like afraid to criticize Katy Perry or something like that.
Well, not Katy Perry.
Okay.
Katy Perry gets lots of criticism, but yes, they're definitely afraid to criticize.
Not in my circles.
BTS.
Okay, the K-pop band. But where are we now? Like, can you once again kind of be the light in the darkness of this moment? If we were dealing with this like rockism prejudice now, or sorry, dealing with this rockism prejudice then, where did we end up 15 years later, and kind of where does your book fit into it? Why leave this book at this moment, mark it down at this moment?
There's a narrower point about music criticism as a profession, which is that, negative reviews in popular music have gotten a lot rarer than they used to be for a variety of reasons. One is that publications rely on freelancers a lot, so they tend to choose someone to review an album who's already into the thing. The other is that the social media has changed the dynamics between listeners and critics and musicians. So if you write a very negative review on a musician and you're big on social media, like, your mentions might get obliterated. And so maybe like subconsciously, maybe some people don't want that kind of stress in their life. And yes, there has been we're kind of in a moment of sympathy is the word I would use for pop stars. In other words, like, a lot of the narratives we hear from performers now are about the difficulties in their life. And that has to do with the personalizing effects of social media. But it means that if you criticize the music, you might be perceived as like piling on to the difficulty that someone is dealing with in their life that they've just expressed on this record. And so I think for a lot of reasons, you see less negative reviews than you used to. And so that's one change. But I also think that at any moment, just because of how the human brain works, like, you can't pay attention to everything. So at any moment, there's always something just outside of our field of vision that we're not paying attention to that's awesome, or that other people will think are awesome, or that the future version of you will think is awesome. I think often now we're polarized around different questions, right? So it's not so much that people are saying like, oh, that's just a silly pop star, like, we're not listening to that. But at least not among people who do this for a living. But, if you have a figure like Morgan Wallen, who gets pulled off of country star, who gets pulled off of country radio after a video was recorded where he uses the N-word during a bleary night out with friends. Morgan Wallen is white. I don't think we know the races of the friends involved. For that reason, I think there's a lot of people who certainly would say like, I'm not listening to that guy, right? Like, that is a place where some people might draw some lines. And so Morgan Wallen becomes a singer, and I'm always interested in figures like this, who's hugely popular in one part of America. And in another part of America, people might say like, absolutely not. This music is not acceptable.
Is it like a rural urban thing, basically?
That probably, a lot of our divide, a lot of our cultural divides, as you know better than me, can map onto rural and urban. And certainly like, there's some truth to that in country music too, but obviously it's also just part of like how people think of themselves, right? And I'm sure And there's all sorts of people that are fans of Morgan Wallen. I mean, it's a great record, which is part of the reason why he attracts so much attention. But that's an example of how even an all-accepting moment, like the relatively all-accepting cultural moment we live in now, isn't actually all accepting, because A, it doesn't actually pay attention to everything because it can't, and B, it doesn't actually accept everything, right? Like, that's the thing about music, like loving music. And this is what I discovered when I was 14, and I kind of still believe it. Like, loving music means hating music. It means valuing one thing more than another thing. And if you met someone who said that they literally loved all music, you'd be like, oh, well, you must not really like any music at all. And so,
is that a place that we're in now? Because it seems like people are worried about that there are a lot of people out there that just like all music.
People might be worried about expressing that in public or in semi-public and social media. But I think if you ask any friend of yours or relative who likes music, if you get to talking, you will probably discover within a few minutes that there is all sorts of stuff that person just hates. Like, I think that's very common, even if it's become maybe a little less acceptable to air those grievances in public, certainly if you're a journalist.
So a friend of yours at some other event basically described being friends with you as like anything that you've thought about, you've underthought. That's what it's like to talk to you about anything. Like, you would just have thought about it from all the different possible angles that it could be thought about. And I do have a bunch of like more specific questions for you about your book, but just because you are who you are and you definitely will have thought about whatever the question is that somebody's asking you, I just want to look and see if like people do have questions for you, because I don't want to cut them off. Because I guess my point is, the thing about you is you have answers.
I can't guarantee they are accurate or illuminating, but I certainly do have answers.
Well, right. I can't also guarantee that, but I think you probably will be. Oh, yeah. See, I was kind of thinking about this myself. The book one way that I've seen you talk about the book is that it's a defense of genres.
Yeah.
And I personally, for whatever reason, hadn't really understood that genres needed defending. And so this person is asking a question like, where are you seeing the discourse? And so I guess like, if you could just tell me where you got the sense that genres needed defending and that they needed defending so badly that you were going to spend time writing this book about it.
So I think, yeah, again, I don't want to exaggerate the war on genre, but I think that there is a growing sense in different quarters that there's something kind of uncool about being too committed to a genre. That there is an expectation that if you're like a rock band, like, of course you'll like collaborate with R&B singers, right? That if you're, and that the people keeping genre narrow are often cast as the enemy, right? You think about the Lil Nas X controversy, where he comes out with Old Town Road and it like makes an appearance on the country chart, and then it gets kicked off the country chart. And people say like, well, the reason is like, it's not country enough. It's not real country music, so it doesn't deserve to be on the country chart. And I think a lot of people rushed to Lil Nas X's defense and said like, no, country needs to be more inclusive, especially of people like Lil Nas X, right? Like, country needs to be more diverse. It needs to include more different kinds of things.
Like a young queer Black artist.
Yes, for example.
Which doesn't really show up on the country charts very often.
Right. But my view of that is that one way in which genres are useful is they tell us something about a community. And if there is a community of country listeners that love Morgan Wallen and Luke Bryan and, all sorts of, various country singers that are making hits right now, and those people aren't listening to Lil Nas X, like, that's interesting. Yeah. And that's something that's useful for us to know about. And I think, I've always, when I write about music, I've always tried to be careful not to give advice to musicians, not to be like, well, this song would be better if the chorus went like this, right? Like, I don't know. I'm not, I'm just a listener. But similarly, I'm also careful not to give advice to genres. So part of what I mean when I say it's a defense of genres is I think it's very common now to hear like, oh, here's what country music needs to do. Here's how country music needs to evolve. Here's how it needs to progress. Here's how it needs to change. And I certainly believe country music will keep changing, but I tend to be a little bit skeptical of people who think they know how country music should change, because the history of any genre, including country music, is the history of it changing in ways we don't quite expect. And my impulse is always, instead of saying like, well, country music is like this right now, but it really should be like that, is to just listen to the thing that exists and recognize that it exists even now. Kind of bizarrely, in 2021, country music exists as an identity that musicians like Casey Musgraves want to be affiliated with, and that listeners consider themselves part of. And to hear it as it exists, and maybe even to celebrate it as it exists, instead of calling for it to change in some way, or for it to be different, or that it shouldn't exist and all music should come together. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in this book. So I hope it doesn't, I hope it doesn't come across as didactic, right? It's mainly just like a history of all these genres. But I think there is not so much that there are enemies of genres, but I get the sense that genres maybe are a little bit uncool right now.
Okay.
And so I think that was maybe something I was responding to.
Yeah, there's an article in this magazine called The New Yorker.
I've heard of The New Yorker.
Yep, me too. It's great. And that's where you can find more Kelefa Sanneh whenever, if you're not getting enough from this book. But
or this talk.
Right. But you sent it to me because we were talking about this, and the writer asserts this thing, which really has struck me, and I've sort of tried it out with other people, and I want to just have you respond to it directly, which is that genre is a reductive, old-fashioned, and inherently problematic idea, and we should all be eager to see it rendered moot. And I was like, we should all be eager to see it rendered moot. Like, it hadn't occurred to me to root against genres, to feel excited that genres might be going away. So
well, this is a fundamental desire of pop music, is the desire not to be fenced in, right? This is Luther Vandross being like, I don't want to just be an R&B singer, like I want a #1 pop hit, right? For Black performers, often leaving R&B, transcending R&B has been a way to like get paid the way white performers get paid, because you're reaching a bigger audience. And so to some Black performers, the world of R&B has felt kind of limiting. Like, I don't want to be trapped in here. And so that desire to like, and that essay, really smart essay by Amanda Petrusic, like really focuses on a lot of the downsides of genres. Here's why it can feel conflicting. Here's why it can feel old-fashioned or maybe reactionary. Like, and here's why musicians will never quite fit well into these categories that we have. And I want to recognize those desires as real and important, while at the same time saying, yes, but here's why we always find ourselves building new categories. Here's why we have these categories in the first place. Here's why whenever we're like knocking down one community, some other community ends up springing up over here. Like, here's why we can't get rid of this urge to form communities with each other. And part of it is this word genre, right? Which sounds like sort of ominous, and because it's French, right? But if you replace that word with community, and you say, like, you talk about musical communities, then maybe it's a little easier to recognize that if you say like, oh, what I want is for musical communities to go away or to not matter, you realize like, well, yeah, there's lots of good reasons to be frustrated with any particular community, but I'm not sure what it would mean for us to not have musical communities anymore.
It's funny because it's like, even within that, within sort of drawing the lines that are these communities or these genres and pointing them out, you also seem like you have this allergy to the people, the kind of gatekeepers, like the people that are like, this is what's authentic. The idea of authenticity is something that I don't think you like that idea. And I don't really like that idea either.
No, but it can be really powerful. Like if you listen to like an NBA Youngboy record, like there's something you feel where there is a feeling that you have that you're listening to someone who's like, even now, like not quite fit for the pop mainstream, right? You're tapping into, and it's not just because he happens to be imprisoned, like you're tapping into a really powerful hip hop thing. And to be, and to feel like you're communing in that way can be really powerful. When I spent years, as part, when my whole life was punk rock and I was part of like a hardcore punk collective in Boston where everyone was like vegetarian and straight edge and it was idealistic, like that was really powerful to be part of that. So I think I really do want to recognize the power of that kind of authenticity and say that like a certain kind of authenticity, which is hard to describe, is something that we're all kind of looking for and getting from music. We're just defining it in different ways and finding it in different places.
But isn't it like the kind of thing where you're talking about, with hip hop, for example, that people are always saying that there's something wrong with hip hop, or hip hop needs to get back to its roots, like
Right.
what's happened to the basic idea of like what's happened to this music today. The old music was better. The old music was more real.
Right.
That's something that it seems like you do really object to.
Well, I think I object to anytime you're painting with that broad a brush. And in the specific case of hip hop, I happen to think that it has like remained awesome over the generations and in its evolving guises.
Agreed.
But again, that feeling that like that this thing over here is somehow like phony and not good, and this thing over here is like somehow real and good. That's the experience of listening to music. Like there's no getting away from that. Whatever the record is that you like, deep down when you hear it, you feel like it's good on some fundamental level, and you feel like it's better than all this other stuff in some way that's even if you know in your brain that like it's all, maybe everyone has their own view about what's good or what's not. When you're listening to something you like, it sounds really good. And so, that desire to label some stuff as good and others as bad, some as like somehow authentic and others as phony, like I'm always going to be skeptical of those terms and ask what we're ruling in or ruling out.
Right.
But I don't think it's possible to enjoy music without making some of those distinctions, which is just another way of saying I don't think it's possible to love music without not loving some other music and ruling it out or leaving it out.
Well, I have to say, reading your book was like one of the first times that I actually felt like I might be equipped to argue with you about music.
Yes.
because I finally had all the information that you have. Like it does feel to me that you didn't, that you left everything on the field. There's not like something else that you have to say about these 7 genres of music. Like,
are you trying to get me to retire?
No, hardly. I am trying to say, like, was there anything that like you actually, didn't get a chance to write about that you still want to write about in this genre, in this field?
Well, in a book like this, there's all sorts of stuff, right? Like this book doesn't begin to tackle Latin music, which is its own history that's just as rich and complex. There wasn't really a place for reggae in this book, and I love reggae. There's all sorts of stuff that, wasn't part of this story because like a genre, when I'm telling my story, in order to make it make sense, I have to leave out a ton of stuff and pick just a few things to include, even though maybe when you read it, it seems like there's a lot in there. When I look at this book, I just think about all the stuff that's like not in there in hopes of making it feel like a story and not an encyclopedia.
Yeah, of course you do. Okay, well, I know we have to stop. I don't know if there are questions. It's kind of hard for me to figure out how questions work in Zoom. I know you've done a lot of these events. I have not, but if there were questions, I would see them. And I think I did like the 2 that we had. Yeah,
I think we crushed it.
Yeah. I mean, I have more questions for you, but I'm just going to take it back to Signal.
Okay. Well, thanks, Zoe, for interrogating me. This has been fun and not like any other interrogation I've ever been subjected to.
Well, hopefully we can do more of these in the future. But I really appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. And thank you to Greenlight for hosting this. Please, everyone, head over there and buy a bunch of books.
Buy the book. It's a good idea. It's going to make you able to argue about music with Kelefa Sanneh, which is hard to do.
You both stole my spiel. Buy the book. The link is in the chat, and you can come on into the stores to buy it as well. I know I will. Thank you both so much for such a great conversation. I wish that it could keep going on, but y'all have your own lives. So let's wrap it up. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a great night. Right.
Thank you.
See ya.